In this section of Revolutionary World, we'll be looking at the French Revolution. By 1789, conditions in France were ripe for revolution as the long-lasting conflict between the French king, Louis XVI, and the rising bourgeoisie, which is a French word that means middle class, exploded into a new political crisis that forever changed France and Europe, as both experienced one of the worst revolutions in modern time, the French Revolution. Now, to understand how the French Revolution starts, we first need to look at French society. The French society in the late 18th century was divided up into three social status groups known as estates. These estates were not equally divided and would be one of the sources of conflict in France. The first estate was the clergy, the church officials. The second estate was the nobility, and the third estate was everyone else, in which the first and second estate stood upon. Now, looking at this chart here, the first estate made up less than 1% of the population. That less than 1% of the population owned 20% of the land, yet paid no taxes. The second estate was made up of around 3% of the population of France, owned 25% of the land, and paid, again, no taxes. While the third estate was made up of 96% of the population, mostly peasants. They owned 55% of the land and yet had to pay 100% of the taxes of France, yet had very little say in the actual government of France. Right there is a humongous issue facing France, is the inequality between the estates. Another major factor in French society is the person at the top of society, and that is Louis XVI, the King of France, who married an Austrian princess. At the age of 14, she was named Marie Antoinette, and he attempts to be an absolute monarch like his grandfather and his father before him, spending millions of dollars on lavish parties and feasts. And this is going to become a problem because France is having other problems and is ripe for revolution. One, France is nearly bankrupt from war debt, thanks in part to the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution. Now, the 7 Years' War had not went well for France. They had lost pretty much all of their colonies in North America and most of their colonies in India. In the American Revolution, while beneficial for France to have an ally now across the Atlantic to kind of stick it to the British, it did cost them a lot of money. And so France is suffering from war debt. Secondly, the third estate is nearly bankrupt from taxes. They're paying 100% of the taxes, and no one else is alleviating or helping that. Third, the nobility is living it up. They're like the king and queen, having lavish parties. They're having a nice lifestyle, while the rest of France is suffering. So again, that first and second estate, this 4% are having a good time, while the other 96% of the French population are not. 4, the Enlightenment is spreading revolutionary ideas of equality. They have to look no further than right across the Atlantic to the Americas to see how this is playing out. And the Enlightenment really taking root in a country kind of governing itself from these enlightened ideas. Many people in Europe, and especially France, are saying, why can't we do that here? And 5th, famine. People are starving. A good portion of the French diet is based on grain and wheat, bread essentially. And for a couple of years there, because of climate problems, France has not had a very good harvest, and so there's not as much bread as there typically is in France. Therefore, there's a shortage. People don't have enough bread to eat. There is famine. And to make matters worse, go back to the third point, the nobility are living it up. They have access to bread, and they're doing just fine, while the rest of France, again, is suffering. So eventually, something has to change. There's no way to ignore these problems. And so there are calls for reform. The Estates General is called. Louis XVI calls a meeting of the three estates, known as the Estates General, to discuss France's financial problems. Yet again, the representation, like in society, is not equal, favoring the first and second estates. The first estate, again, less than 1% of the population, has 300 members there to represent their interest, and the first estate as a whole gets 1 vote to cast. The second estate, again, 3% of the population has 300 members there to support their interest, and again, like the first estate, as a whole, the second estate gets 1 vote. Now, the third estate has 600 people to represent the 96% of the population of France, and they also only get 1 vote to cast. So in this sense, the first and second estates can kind of gang up on the third estate. So on questions like taxation, should we tax the first and second estates? Well, the first estate would say no, the second estate would say no, the third would say yes, 2-1. Sorry, the first and second estates are not getting taxed anymore. Third estate, you're just going to have to make up the difference. It's not fair or equal. So this meeting is called on May 5th of 1789. As of June 17th, 1789, the National Assembly is established. The third estate leaves this meeting feeling it's not fair, it's not equal, and they form the National Assembly, a new legislature representing the people, not the states. And over time, members of the first and second estates will slowly join them, yet the estates won't matter anymore. It's not about the estates or what class you come from. It's about the population as a whole coming together and making decisions. It's this sense of equality that's starting to form in France, a very enlightened idea. Doesn't matter about your title or where you come from, we're all equal here. Well, the king doesn't like this. And so he actually locks them out of their meeting room, and they are forced to go to a neighboring tennis court, where they take the tennis court oath on June 20th of 1789. So locked out of their meeting room, the National Assembly moves to a nearby tennis court, it's really more of a handball court, and swear an oath to meet in that location until they have developed and drafted a new constitution. So already these calls for revolutionary ideas are beginning. And it's in this climate that the French Revolution begins. Starting with the National Assembly gaining support, Louis XVI starts to make moves to disband it by force by placing extra troops in Paris, as many began to fear that the king was unwilling to reform and was going to use force to put down any kind of opposition to him. Well, this is when on July 14th, 1789, we have the storming of the Bastille. Fearing military force, a militia, a military force of civilians there in Paris, begin to arm themselves and storm the Bastille in search of gunpowder. Now, in France, a lot of people had access to guns to a certain degree, but what they didn't have is large artillery and access to large amounts of gunpowder. That was kind of done on purpose. Many countries in Europe didn't want to arm their citizens because they can fire back. A lot of times the governments of Europe would use their army, the only people that had weapons and gunpowder, to put down rebellions. It's going to be kind of hard to put down the rebellions when the people that are rebelling are armed as well. So a lot of times governments would keep stockpiles of weapons and especially gunpowder in large quantities in castles or fortress-like areas. The Bastille was just one of those places. It was seen as kind of an armory. But also during this time, it's being used as a prison. And when this militia storms the Bastille, they actually release the prisoners, all 7 of them, and the Bastille is torn down brick by brick. This is seen as a symbolic sign that this feudalistic castle fortress there in Paris that kind of symbolized this feudalistic practice of estates and classes and nobility is being torn down. And as far as the 7 prisoners being released, they're not murderers or robbers or rapists. These were political enemies of the state that were released. Now this whole act of storming the Bastille here on July 14th is seen as the start of the French Revolution, and even in today is celebrated in France as Bastille Day in the same way that Americans might celebrate Independence Day on July 4th. Now, a day after storming the Bastille, the militia, now called the National Guard, takes on a new flag, the tricolor, and it will come to symbolize the people of France. Now, the peasants out in the countryside begin to take this a step further when they begin to refuse to pay feudal dues, determined to gained control of land and food they felt was rightly theirs. Many of these peasants were working the lands of nobility and these nobles and feeling like, we're doing the work, why shouldn't we have more of an equal say and share of the land that we are working for you? So in the city of Paris, you have revolutionaries storming the Bastille, and out in the country, you have peasants refusing their feudal dues and starting to rebel against the nobility in the countryside. So on both fronts, both urban and rural, you see this revolutionary act taking place. Now, this would lead to what's called the Great Fear, as unsupported rumors start to spread throughout the countryside that royal troops were being sent to force the peasants back into servitude. So many peasants fear that these troops are going to come in and force them back onto the farm, force them to be peasants once more, this feudalistic type peasantry. So what they do is start to break into the manors and the houses of these nobility and destroy any records of servitude, any records that say that they one time were a peasant and belonged to this noble. So it's a very, very big act of rebellion by the peasantry due to this great fear that the king is going to come in and force them back to the farms. Now, on August 4th, 1789, so all this stuff is happening very, very quickly here in just a matter of a few months, the National Assembly abolishes all those feudal laws in France, making all French citizens equal, taking on a slogan that will become synonymous with the revolution here of liberty, equality, and fraternity. These will become the major goals of the French Revolution. Liberty to the sense that freedom to all in all things, whether it be the press, religion, speech, that you have the freedom to do these things, very much like what America had done after the American Revolution. Second, equality, that we're going to treat everyone equally under the law. There aren't certain rules and things that apply to the peasants that don't apply to the nobility. Everything and everybody will be equal. And finally, fraternity, in that all in mutual partnership with one another, expressing a sense of brotherhood, that we're all in this together, that we are equal, that we should come together in all things. Different classes of people, different religions of people, different groups of people should kind of come together and increase this sense of being French, that we're all equal and we're all doing this together, the sense of brotherhood, of love and affection toward one another. So these three words will become the standard of the French Revolution that they're trying to achieve: liberty, equality, and fraternity. In accordance with this idea, on August 26th of 1789, the National Assembly creates the Declaration of the Rights of Man. This document restates these enlightened ideas, stressing individual rights of liberty, property, and security, that all men are created equal, that only taxpayers can vote. So going back as a challenge to that first and second estate that paid no taxes yet had all the say in the government, that's not going to happen anymore. Only taxpayers can vote, and power comes from the will of the people. All those things are very enlightened ideas. So you're starting to see the Enlightenment take hold in the actual society and the governmental operations of France. Now, on October 5th, 1789, the Parisian women march on Versailles. Versailles was the palace of the king and queen. It's where they lived. If you remember, it was established by Louis XIV just a few miles outside of Paris. These hungry peasant women decided to march on Versailles to demand their concerns over bread shortages be addressed by the king and queen. Another thing they're looking for is actually food. They know that the king has a huge storehouse full of food and they want access to it. So they march on Versailles. It's not just women. Men join in this as well, but it's started by women. And they break into Versailles, and eventually this mob forces the royal family to return to Paris. They want to make sure that they can keep an eye on the king and queen and let the king and queen realize how bad things are going on just a few miles away in Paris. So the National Assembly is now able to keep a close watch on the king, ensuring that the revolution will survive, that he cannot escape and go somewhere else or rally his forces outside of their watch. And this is how things go for the next couple of years until 1791, when the National Assembly finally completes the Constitution for a constitutional monarchy in France, which strips Louis XVI of all his legislative powers. Legislative powers will now be held by the Legislative Assembly, formerly known as the National Assembly. And the legislative power that this new assembly holds is going to be held by property owners, which is about half of the adult males in France, embracing Enlightened principles here. Also, this legislative assembly abolishes the First Estate officially by taking and confiscating church lands and making the clergy loyal civilians of the state, not the church. So you're starting to see some attacks on the religious faith and the church of France. Now, in August of that year, the royal family is caught attempting to flee to Austria to avoid accepting this new constitution and brought back to Paris. Again, Louis XVI wanted to be an absolute monarch. He doesn't want to be bound by a constitution who's going to limit his powers and his authority. So he attempts to flee to Austria. Why Austria? His wife, Marie Antoinette, was from Austria. She was the Austrian princess, if you'll remember. So in his mind, he believes if I can get to Austria, I can rally Austrian troops to help me come back and crush this rebellion in his mind. Well, it's really not even a rebellion. It's breaking into an outright revolution before his eyes. And finally, in 1792, we have the Declaration of Pillnitz, in which Prussia and Austria declare war on France, because they fear revolutions like what France is going through might happen in their own country. What would happen if the citizenry of Prussia and Austria start declaring that the king should have limited power and the power of the citizens and the population should be more spoken for? This would be detrimental to their society and their power. So they are trying to send a message to France and to the rest of Europe that you don't do this. We're going to go in, we're going to crush this, we're going to stomp it out, and set an example for the rest of Europe that if you do this in your country, this is what's going to happen to you. So this leads to the militarization of the French government to prepare for this upcoming war. So this will end the first stage of the French Revolution. However, the next stage of the French Revolution becomes much, much more radical and violent as new political leadership takes control of the revolution, calling for the suspension of the monarchy, a more republican type of government, and more governmental changes at any and all costs.